Welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining today for the School of History, Archaeology and Religion contribution to the Cardiff University Talking Anti-Racism series. We're absolutely thrilled and delighted to have Dr. Musie, beg pardon, who will be speaking on classics and anti-racism toward a brighter future, or for the Welsh speakers, Clasuron Gwrth-Hiliaeth. As points of housekeeping, this is in the webinar format, so you should automatically be on mute. If you'd like to ask any questions, you're welcome to pop them in the Q&A as we go along, and there'll be time at the end, and we'll take some more then. Dr. Musie is an ancient historian and public engagement specialist, who I've just learned is sort of returning to Cardiff University, which was a student for a little while. But her research focuses on race and ethnicity in the ancient world, medieval manuscripts from the Ethiopian Eritrean traditions, and interconnectivity between the ancient Mediterranean world and Northeast Africa. She is a trustee of Classics for All, which is a national campaign to promote the teaching of classical languages and classical civilizations in UK state schools, and has a very long speaking list on ancient history, community participation, and collaborative research. Without further ado, May, would you be so kind as to take it away?
Yes, and thank you. I should say Swansea University rather than Cardiff University, but I did a joint MA with Cardiff University. Shmai Shiroti, thank you so much for coming to this talk. I generally want it to be as inclusive as possible and to open up the seminar for discussions towards the end. So I guess what I want to bring to this table is just really a combination of professional and personal experience of how my journey towards classics, and also my personal experience of the horrors of racism, and the kind of discovery of accepting my heritage and identity, but also how we can contribute to the discipline as a whole to a possible brighter future, and to try and make it as inclusive as possible. So on to what I'll be talking about today. I saw this just about a week ago, and I thought this is just absolutely perfect to try and encapsulate what anti-racism means, and this was perfect because it came from a United Nations Refugee Council, and as you will get to hear, I was a former child refugee of the Ethiopian Eritrean Civil War, so it kind of spoke to me on several levels. And this is extremely powerful message of where it's really not just about collective responsibilities to try and be anti-racist, but also on a kind of individual responsibilities, and in our communities, in our homes, in our schools, in our workplaces, as well as in our families. And so in terms of anti-racism and what that means, we'll be talking and looking at the terminology, but also focusing on how we can perhaps move forward and to try and implement that in every aspect of our kind of surroundings. So the first thing I'll be talking about is just to give you a little bit of a kind of history of who I am and where I come from, and hopefully you can understand some of the things that we'll be talking about, the themes and how I came about it. And then looking at the terminology in terms of the three very sort of focused ideas about anti-racism, decolonization, and EDI. And sometimes they try to get all a bit grouped together, and there are some overlapping themes in a kind of Venn diagram, but they do actually mean different things and require different aspects of actions. And then I'll be looking at what anti-racism means in the context of higher education and national policy. And so the national policy I'll be talking about, because we are in Wales, will be sort of in a Welsh context. And then really looking at classics and anti-racism, and then ending in reflections. So I hope you can see where I'm going with this, and you won't get too bored or well, anything else. So I guess what I'll start off with is really my personal experience, and I put that in as the good immigrant, because there is such a big focus and I suppose expectations from the UK in respect to migrants and immigrants and asylum seekers to try and assimilate as much as they can into a society that perhaps is slightly different from where they come from. And in a sense, for me, I came from Eritrea and via Sudan ended up in the UK, in London, at the age of 8, and then having to navigate different spaces, language barriers, and then finally sort of having to live in this kind of limbo between a sort of Eritrean Ethiopian heritage and the British heritage and British cultural identity and so forth. So in a sense, I've always felt in a limbo of trying to appease both sets of societal identities, and it turned out that it was extremely restrictive. So for me, to try and survive, it was a kind of rejection of my own heritage and my own cultural background, to trying to assimilate into what the British lifestyle was, and to try and act British and to try and speak British and so forth. So sort of being from a very heavily Ethiopian Eritrean background, grown up in London and having to kind of navigate the spaces, the food that you eat, the clothes that you wear and so forth, it was a very stark experience, and it's something that I'm still trying to untangle and learn from, and sort of make peace with it myself. And I ended up in Swansea University just purely by accident. I wanted to, I suppose, escape that kind of restrictive environment, which I saw it in, from my own kind of interpretation of, this sort of Ethiopian Eritrean communities and in London, and then trying to battle and be this, good British citizen. I came to Wales, and classics was something that I never thought about, never was in my sphere. I went to a school, a very poor performing school in the 80s in South Lambeth, and it was only through my experiences in English literature and learn about the Greeks through books like Arcadia, Tom Stoppar's Arcadia, but also Egyptology, doing extracurricular activities around Egyptology, that I came through that way and learned about the Greeks and Romans. And then there was also going to the library almost on a daily basis, that I came to it learning about creation myths and so forth. Now, my university experience, just looking back, I was the only Black person in the whole cohort, so I stuck out like a sore thumb. But what really intrigued me was really learning about particularly Greek history and historiography, particularly around Herodotus, and then the introduction to the ancient novels. And in that sense, I found myself and my heritage through the story of Caerdydd in the Ethiopian story. So I should put the quotations around Ethiopia, as in ancient Ethiopia, not modern Ethiopia. And that, in a sense, made me think about, okay, well, this is absolutely amazing how you have Northeast civilizations represented in these literary texts. And so that's what drew me to the ancient Greek novels. And when I did start my PhD journey, somebody recommended I read Edward Said, Orientalism, and then my eyes opened. And as Gary Young, a journalist, talks about his racism experience in the Northeast, once you you know, sort of see something, it's very hard to unsee it. And in a sense, that's what happened with me. I started seeing institutions, and I started seeing how racism can be so systematic. And Said talks about the idea of Orientalism being quite systematic in every aspect of institutions. And then in when I came to Oxford, I happened to be in the classics department, and within few months there was a conference on Ethiopian and Eritrean manuscripts in the classics department, and that really surprised me, where I thought, my goodness, you know, I didn't know that corner of the world contributed to this human civilization, because that's what you got taught throughout school and throughout college, that actually you have these certain societies that have contributed to the human pursuit of knowledge, and then others haven't. And so the fact that there was this conference and it was about Ethiopian Eritrea and the contribution of Ethiopian Eritrea in the manuscript tradition really made me think about my own experiences, my own personal journey in terms of rejecting it and now finally accepting it. And that took me to the journey to Aksum, and in 2019, where these manuscripts were held in this monastery, and it was also a chance to see and sort of be part of a family that I didn't see since the war. So this was a kind of self-discovery on so many levels in terms of family, education, heritage and identity. And I guess in terms of professional experience, I have talked a lot about and did facilitate a lot of community organized engagement projects around ancient history, medieval manuscripts, you know, working with different communities that feel marginalized in Oxford, in Swansea, in London. So my work encompassed trying to get that aspect of exchanging knowledge between higher education and those communities, to try and exchange knowledge and for it to be reciprocal. So the fact that, you know, it's not about the knowledge transfer from these HE institutions, but actually gaining something from these indigenous scholars, as well as community members and so forth, to help in the contribution of knowledge. And I have worked on several working groups and committees in Oxford and in Swansea in terms of putting into practice EDI and decolonising museum spaces and art galleries. So that's really the kind of background I'm coming from. And so when I thought about, okay, well, what does anti-racism mean? And, you know, this seems to be the kind of buzzword since 2020. Everybody in every institution is so keen to be, you know, anti-racist, and let's decolonize this, let's decolonize that. And what does it actually mean? And I want to reiterate that actually, let's think about the kind of intersectional elements of discrimination. And again, I'm going to go to the United Nations. And, you know, I saw this image and I thought this is actually encapsulates perfectly what we talk about, the intersectional forms of discrimination. Now, in the next slide, I'll be looking at what do those terms mean, because they do get lumped into the same box. So anti-racism, for me, in some sense, is this kind of a very strategic, this kind of advocating for transformative change in terms of promoting racial equity. And it's also about, you know, giving voice, giving the sort of chair to those who feel marginalized, for them to make decisions, to get them to be decision makers, but also trying to understand actually this kind of impact of white supremacy that has been around for so many centuries as a result of colonialism will take a very long time to dismantle that. And it's trying to understand that this has become normalized, and it's something that Edward Said talks about. It's this kind of normalization of the other, of trying to describe the other through literature, through film, through, you know, our kind of HU practice and so forth. So it seems really, really normal. And then when we try to dismantle that, some institutions and some people will get really offended because it feels like an attack on them and what they have thought for so many years and for so many centuries. And it's this fact of, you know, trying to accept actually it's not about you in terms of personally, but it's about the institutions, it's about the systems and practices, and trying to develop strategies to address that, to change that, to try and make it as inclusive as possible. Now, if we go into decolonization, now this actually has a kind of you know, we're thinking about the withdrawal of political, military and governmental rule of colonized land in this kind of formal setting. But it's more than that. It's decolonizing the kind of system that has been brought in there by the colonized to rethink, to reframe and reconstruct the sort of Eurocentric educational curriculum and the research from a kind of colonial lens. And it's trying to undo the colonial practices and trying to reposition and rebalance the power. And I guess it's, you know, we've got, as a young child, I always felt in a sense that, you know, Black people were inferior to white people, and that's what's been normalized. And this overarching white worldview kind of dominates everything. It dominates knowledge creation, it dominates production. And then lastly, EDI, which, you know, it just is a catch or, you know, terminology, which, you know, there's several roles that have come out that encompasses EDI, but there is this sort of performative nature about it that often kind of frustrates a lot of Black and Asian people, where it just feels as if institutions are performing EDI rather than actually thinking about what that really means. And I've put equality and equity because they mean different things, and in a sense I think equity might be better in terms of looking at individuals rather than groups and trying to support their needs rather than as a collective, and diversity and inclusion. So the EDI in a sense are just the kind of the practice of trying to make people feel inclusive, whilst I see anti-racism and decolonization, this real kind of trying to dismantle the system to try and create a racial equity for a post kind of racial society, which there's always hope. Now, you may recognize some of these books, and I think in the last few years there's been this kind of explosion about race and talking about race, particularly with Rhan, who I saw in Oxford a few years ago, the kind of frustration that a lot of Black people feel about, oh my goodness, how not again am I going to put myself out there to try and explain to you how I feel and why this system is disadvantageous to me, biased towards me, and so forth. And so there has been lots and lots of books now to try and explain what you know, Black and Asian experience has been from, you know, for a very long time. So it's that field is growing, and I think that we're all taking it in, and there has been institutions who are putting out policies to try and change that narrative. What I've put on here, I follow this person, Shireen Daniels. She's really great, and if you get an opportunity, do follow her. She is a coach. She talks about sort of dismantling systematic racism in workplaces. She's from a HR experience, but I feel that what she talks about here really does hit home in terms of what a lot of people like myself have faced, you know, the sort of the gaslighting, the defensiveness and the policing and the kind of fragility and the dismissal and the whataboutery, and you know, there's always I always feel slightly triggered every time I go online or, you know, go into these spaces, white spaces, and having to explain a lot of things, but also having to kind of water down a lot of things because you feel that person is vulnerable, and so you're putting their feelings in on top of the agenda. And Gary Young, yet again, I'm talking about Gary Young, and you know, just recently got his book Dispatches from the Diaspora. He talks about, you know, the sort of the people with the least amount of power are supposed to feel the most empathetic, you know, and I feel that's quite a telling thing about a lot of people who do not have that much power, and yet they are supposed to understand and sympathize and empathize with those who do, who feel victimized, or, you know, who feel that in some way it's about them. Now we are in we are in this kind of HE sort of environment, and I started thinking about my experiences of being at Oxford University when we were going for the Race Equality Charter in 2018, and the long journey that we were going on to try and get this charter award, and looking at the institution and realizing actually, you know, there is no way that this institution at this present moment can apply for it, because so much work has to be done to recognize the kind of racial inequalities within the institution. Now, the Race Equality Charter started off via the Advanced HE, which is a member-led organization which tries to support universities to improve the representation and progress of Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. It is, in a sense, trying to put some sort of framework in there, but it is, you know, the onus is on the members to apply, and in a sense, there's not that many that have had the award. So if you look at the stats here, this is just from last year, we've had 97 institutions as members, but only 26 have had the bronze award. So that means that, you know, the rest of them are still on their Race Equality Charter journey. And not surprisingly, you've had a rather negative press coverage, particularly by the Daily Telegraph and the government, seeing this as a supposedly attack on freedom of speech. In actual fact, it's trying to put a framework in trying to represent Black and Asian and minority ethnic people in higher education, because of the lack of representation. But there are some drawbacks, and one big drawback about this is this kind of like, it's a halfway house. Whilst with Athena Swan, in some sense, you have got this kind of monetized incentive, with Race Equality Charter at the present moment, there isn't this monetized incentive to join. So it's just this kind of like, well, do institutions just see it as another type of work that they have to do, rather than this kind of, well, we have to do this, and you know, it will change, and it, you know, we will create meaningful change, transformative change. Now, being in coming back to Swansea University's work, I've seen quite a lot of changes in the last 10 years of where you've had Welsh policies being quite progressive, in comparison to England as well. So it was really interesting to see how the Welsh government have now come up with their anti-racist Wales action plan. And, you know, this is basically trying to, you know, look at their own policies in health and education, employment, and seeing how they can become anti-racist. Now, what's really interesting is that it used to be called the Race Equality Action Plan, and then they changed it to anti-racist. So even the terminology has changed because of the commitment. And, you know, this is a sort of co-design with communities who've lived in experiences of racism. And so the kind of, I suppose, the focus has changed. It's more about the communities and putting the communities at the heart of this action plan. And so it'll be interesting to see how this formulates by the time that their vision is realized in 2030. But there is so many progressive ideas in there in terms of, you know, sort of incorporating history of slavery and colonialism, reviewing street names and monuments and so forth. So that is quite an interesting aspect for me to see how the Welsh government is really thinking about this seriously. And some of you may recognise that in 2018 there was the Royal Historical Society report, which, you know, it didn't come as a surprise to many Black and Asian people that there is a lack of representation in HE when it comes to students and staff. And again, it's how far have we come since that report has come out? For a lot of people, they would say not far enough. Now, let me get into the kind of heart of the talk, which is about classics and anti-racism. And I've kind of put Martin Burnell, Black Athena there, and also Black Andromeda there as this kind of interesting pieces to talk about race in the ancient world. Now, Martin Burnell obviously wasn't a classicist, but he was, you know, very much educated at a PhD level, and so for him to look at classical practices in terms of scholarship and recognize that actually it's incredibly Eurocentric, as one reviewer said on there, you know, it's a swashbuckling foray into the very heart of racist Eurocentric historiography. Already one can hear the knives being sharpened against Burnell, and now that was 30 years ago and we're still talking about Burnell. I was at a Black Athena 30th anniversary just before the pandemic, and there were, you know, some interesting panelists there, and, you know, there was a lot of talk about, oh, we should move on from this, you know, that Black people should just, you know, stop blaming themselves and being victims and move on from this. And this is Afrocentric ideas about, you know, the classical world and, you know, this sort of legacy. And it just really alarmed me that it would come from, you know, a particular panelist. And it's this kind of idea that, well, actually, Burnell raised some really interesting points. And yes, there were some methodological, perhaps, errors or however you want to put it. But, you know, what he really did was to try and look at the scholarship and say, actually, this is wrong. This is needs to be, you know, looked at in a kind of bigger context, in the context of the relationships, the cultural exchanges between Greece and Rome and other countries and their contributions to Greek and Roman civilization. Because, you know, we can see the legacies of that, and the legacies of that is this kind of, you know, where we have the idea of Western civilization is at the top of the hierarchy of, you know, sort of societal superiority, and that's just not true. And so there are these persisting ideas, and you think, well, how have that come to be? And it's these kind of problems within scholarship that have contributed to this. So this is why I still feel that Burnell is extremely relevant. But also from my PhD work in terms of the looking at representation of other in Greek and Roman literary sources, particularly the fiction, and thinking about how the Greeks thought about race and ethnicity. And one particular novel, The Ethiopian Stories, I've talked about, Heliodorus, one of the characters is represented as white, but, you know, she's from Black Ethiopians, and it's the story of Andromeda, and it's this kind of, well, you know, the whitewashing of Andromeda in classical, in Renaissance art, and since then, where you have this kind of sort of, we're talking about Greeks and Romans and the surrounding areas looking at race and ethnicity in a completely different light to how we see it, and yet you've got this kind of years and centuries of whitewashing in some respect, and trying to tell people, well, this is how Greeks and Romans thought about race and ethnicity, in the sense that, you know, you've got white as top, and the erasure of Black characters, the erasure of Blackness. So then I thought about, okay, well, you know, it's not just my own experience here as a classicist and one of the very few Black classicists. You know, there are other people whose experiences should also be thought about in terms of how to make classics inclusive. And here we've got Professor Patrice Rankin, one of the very few Black classicists, who talks about his own experiences in terms of trying to navigate the kind of traditional fields of classics as a Black person. And he talks about the American Journal of Philology and the kind of problematic nature of the founding fathers, the problematic nature of classics and slavery, and the impact of that on American society, but also on his own experience in trying to navigate, you know, classics in HE. And one of the things he talks about is another person's experience of an international classics conference that took place in 2019, and this was 150th anniversary of this American conference. And I'll show you in a second what I'm talking about. But it's this kind of like, well, you know, have things moved on? It's 2019 and we're still talking about us being at the periphery of these spaces, us being, you know, the outsiders, and having to work twice as hard to try and get there, where our research isn't considered, you know, sort of strong enough in comparison to our white counterparts because of where we're from, or the fact that we're bringing a different perspective to it. And so, you know, I just want to encourage you to read, it's an open access article called Classics, Race and Community Engaged, of Patrice's words, and think about, okay, well, you know, have we really moved on in terms of trying to be as inclusive as possible in terms of the scholars that are recruited to work in our field? Now, the controversy that he talks about in this essay with regards to another colleague is one that we're all trying to get over in some respects. So Professor Daniel Padilla, he was one of the panelists on the future of classics, and one audience member who's white accused him of getting his job because he was Black, and so in a sense the whole conference just, you know, sort of got derailed. And you know, Danielle was trying to point out with stats the lack of representation in terms of journal acceptance of Black scholars, and this person said, you know, what they've said, and this in a sense brought out conversations about the kind of lack of representation of Black scholars across the discipline, you know. And his response, which I feel is brilliant, is that, well, yeah, of course, you know, and this is the reason why I should have this job. And he brought out an article post the conference, which then really put people's backs. You know, he was talking about the sort of dismantling classics, and in a sense he's talking about the systems that make classics exclusive, you know, which is the same thing that Saeed talks about. You know, in order for us to try and move on and to become inclusive, we have to actually start thinking about dismantling the system, or at least look at it and realize, okay, it's so biased, it's so discriminatory, that we need to start off fresh. And that's what Danielle was trying to say, but then, you know, the press got hold of it, and we all know in some ways of what happens when that gets out into the public, and you know, there was this kind of burning it to the ground and so forth, and people got really upset, and in a sense, you know, it kind of proved Danielle's point. And so I'm going to talk about my own little experience that happened to me recently, where I thought, oh, okay, well, you know, again, we are here talking about race, talking about the sort of anti-blackness that exists. So I guess you probably would have to be hiding under a rock to not know about the Cleopatra Pura. I put out a tweet which was reposted in an article that was written by a classics colleague, and just because it was just there was such backlash with the casting of Cleopatra in this latest Netflix series. And sure enough, the tweets that I've had back just showed clearly that a lot of people didn't really engage with the actual article, which is to talk about Cleopatra and saying we don't really know very much about her, let's look at the sources. But there is this kind of pushback that Egypt is considered not African. Africa is Black, and these are rooted in racist ideas. These are rooted in colonial ideas, and the fact that a lot of the responses were coming from Egyptians as well as Greeks was quite remarkable, because Egypt, let's not forget, was colonized, Greece was colonized, and so there's quite a lot of internal colonization going on there, where there's this kind of proximity to the whiteness of Egyptians. Now, I'm not saying that all the Egyptians thought this way, but there's this kind of homogenizing of the Egyptians, and there's Black people in Egypt. There are Black Egyptians, but the response that I had just really, again, was so triggering, and the fact that actually we've not really moved on from this kind of 18th, 19th century ideas about race, and how that has affected other nations too, and their responses to ancient history and how they view their ancient heritage and ancient culture. And so I got accused of, sort of being Afrocentric, racist even, and the fact that, how it would be dodgy if they cast Michelle Obama, or a white Greek lady to play Michelle Obama and so forth. And then there was these, really upsetting racist images, sort of, if a Tarzan will always be white, and, it was just horrendous. But what was coming out of it was that it's extremely telling of the sort of impact of colonialism on certain countries within Africa, but also this kind of separation of, sort of trying to look at historical figures like Cleopatra and recognizing that Greeks and Romans and Egyptians and ancient Ethiopians and so forth, ancient people had different ideas about race and ethnicity and different ideas about borders and so forth. And then what the modern backlash is in terms of that representation. And so it was extremely disheartening, but also encouraging that actually we need to do some more work on this. But then the next level was that you've had the official response to this, which is the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities in Egypt, and using DNA, using statues to push forward this idea, this kind of definite idea that Cleopatra was Greek or Cleopatra was Egyptian, or a mix of both. Again, the kind of it didn't really matter, but what they were saying was just this kind of really dangerous ideas about race science, really dangerous ideas of Africa in terms of blackness, which it's extremely disheartening. And so it was quite upsetting, but then this isn't anything new. Just a year ago, there was a backlash in trying to think about Egypt having Black pharaohs. Now, this is a known thing, and yet again we were here, sort of having a problem. But it's, as Rhan said, is trying to understand the racialized legacy of Egyptology, and you can understand why there is such a disconnect. Now, there has been campaigns to drop the term sub-Saharan. Well, this particular person in 2010, you know, to sort of put out a campaign to drop this racist term, because it is racist, because it is saying that there are certain countries say mostly Arab nations in Africa that has a proximity to white, and they are superior, and then below that you have Black Africans and their societies are inferior. Now obviously that isn't true in reality, and you know, it's about, well, who's in the north and who's in the east, who's in the south, who's in the west. Geographically this really doesn't make any sense, so why can't we just stick with saying, you know, north or northeast Africa? But actually there is this uncomfortable nature of certain nations using Africa as a kind of identity because they associate that with Blackness. Now, as I said, this wasn't something new, and I'm sure a lot of people will also think about the time when you had a debate about Roman soldiers being Black in Britain, and then also about the casting of Achilles as a Black person. So I've put here a quote from Tim Whitmarsh, who is the Regius Professor of Greek in Cambridge University. And again, we're talking about, you know, sort of modern ideas about race and projecting it into a kind of ancient context, and the kind of uncomfortable nature about that. We trying to understand that actually this is the lens that we're seeing this through is through a colonial lens where there's racial hierarchies, and I guess it's really up to us as public historians, as classicists and ancient historians, to try and push back on that popular narrative that is existing in the popular sphere, in social media, and in TV and so forth. But this isn't normal, you know, that people sort of playing roles and they're white consistently. That isn't the normal representation of the world, and so there is a need as scholars to try and push that back. And so I'm coming towards the end of my talk now, and the kind of reflections I'm thinking about is to trying to change that narrative in the public sphere. So what I found really exciting is, you know, looking at my medieval colleagues, looking at my early modernists, thinking about how to change that narrative. We've got Verena Krebs, who has changed the narrative around the kind of Northeast African exchanges with Latin Europe in the Middle Ages, which is on diplomatic relations. So this is turning things around about, you know, sort of slavery in Africa and there's nothing else. It's actually about the kind of, well, Europe didn't really discover Africa, and actually there has been diplomatic relations for a very long time. It's also changing the narrative about, you know, sort of archaeologists and Egyptologists, and thinking about, you know, sort of native Sudanese, native people coming up, you know, the scholarly circles to do archaeology in Sudan, to do archaeology in Egypt, rather than it being totally from a kind of global north-centric system. And also looking at the ancient sources and trying to really grapple with the idea of what the our ancient counterparts thought about race. And this is something that a colleague, Sarah, wrote about, untangling Blackness. Another book that I think is quite significant is that also this kind of trade interactions and seeing the sort of cultural interactions between Greece and Rome and India and China and Ethiopia and Eritrea, and to bring that to the fore and to say, well, actually this is what was going on in the ancient world, rather than this kind of narrow prism of Greeks and Romans going out and finding things and then bringing it back, and then you've got, you know, Britain and US being the inheritors of that civilization. So again, to quote Michelle Obama here, one of the things that can change the discipline is really representation. Representation matters, and it's really great that we do have the changing sphere in terms of representation. So Professor Shelley Haley, who's now the president of the Society of Classical Society in America, and we've got Catherine Harlow, who's the director of the Institute of Classical Studies, and we've got Emily Greenwood, who's one of those really early pioneers of Black scholars in classics pushing the boundaries, and we have Jackie Murray. And it's really encouraging to see those faces, those visible faces, but it hasn't been easy for every single one of these women. And reading some of their experiences, particularly Shelley's experience of how she got into classics, but also of her growing up in a very segregated environment, is extremely harrowing, and that casts a long shadow. And we try and think about the impact of our personal environments and why we study classics. For me, it has become quite personal, and it's thinking about trying to make it in a way to accept my own heritage and to accept my own identity, and to also think about the diversity, the true diverse nature of the ancient world. That has been one of the motivating factors for me. I mentioned Sarah Derbu. She's one of my compatriots. And interestingly, she kind of vocalizes this here, to think about beyond Greek and Roman civilizations, not just about Greece and Italy, but the kind of cultural exchanges, cultural impacts that has had. But then also thinking, well, why can't students work on things that they feel really interested in? So not strictly ancient Greece or Rome, to look at Nubia, to look at China and different aspects of that. Now, these are just suggestions. I'm not saying this is a roadmap. It's just through my own experience of what has been happening and what I'm hoping to happen, and how to contribute to that, how to change a departmental's approach when we think about our discipline, what is working in some sense, so countering and documenting racism. There's so much more public history now through social media and various other things, but it's also kind of building networks, and there's been several networks that have sprung up, which is really great, and the diversity of current literature that's available that are pushing through characters that often have been marginalized, and also to trying to embed anti-racism, decolonization in more than just a reading list. We're thinking about the kind of strategic change here. We're talking about beyond just training for staff and students. We're talking about buy-in from senior leadership, but also to diversifying board memberships in classics organizations. I am a member, a trustee of Classics Royal and the Roman Society, and yeah, I'm the only Black person there, so it would be really nice if there are other people who look like me to be there. But I know this is really difficult in terms of time, resource, staff allocation and so forth. Is trying to look at what resources are available across the field in terms of HE initiatives, looking at knowledge exchange, looking at the big push around civic engagement, big push around public engagement, and trying to work with that to try and get some resources and to think about intersectional work. And then looking at our other departments, our other disciplines and non-academic organizations, God forbid, working with museums and art galleries, and really seeing what kind of models we can emulate to try and think about pushing our discipline forward, and then reaching out to our experts. So if you don't know about racism and racism experiences and decolonization and what have you, then why don't you get an expert in to talk about those things? But it's also getting to know your local area. If you're thinking about recruiting students from a local area, it's trying to think about the demographic nature of that area and working with your communities and potential students to think, well, how is my subject relevant, and how can I make it exciting? And I saw this on Twitter, and I thought this is absolutely perfect. I think this is, you know, where you've got lots of institutions trying to do something, but not really thinking about it, and not thinking about it intersectionally, and not thinking about it beyond just performative nature. So please do, you know, have a look at this person's profile, and you can get, she makes really interesting graphic details on anti-racism and diversity and so forth. So I leave you on this point. So thank you. It's a bit of a whirlwind, sorry.
Thank you very much. I'll have to do the clapping and assume that everyone else is clapping in their lounge rooms. So we've got sort of 10 minutes for questions. So if everyone, you can either pop it in the Q&A or put your hand up and I can give you permission to sleep. Oh, Jane Henderson has confirmed in the Q&A that she is clapping.
Oh, amazing. Thanks, Jane. Sorry, I can't see anyone. And it's really disconcerting.
Oh, so has Nikki.
Yeah. I trust your word, Emily, and I'm sure.
More clapping coming in. While people are gathering thoughts, I just wanted to sort of ask, because thinking in terms of the pipeline of, you know, classicists of the future, do you sort of have some tips in terms of things that have worked with essentially sort of teaching, you know, either teaching or sort of more public engagement stuff with young people? Do you have sort of stuff that's worked particularly well for you?
What has worked? Actually, yes. So on several levels. So in January, I went to, February actually, to give a talk in a Cardiff primary school, and for a number of people to access and outreach work really needs to kind of start very early, to think about changing minds and hearts, and so coming from an access and outreach background, I knew that there was a lot of research that the earlier that you talk to young people about, you know, sort of going on to higher education, pursuing different subjects, the better it will be. And so I got this opportunity to go, and it was sponsored by Arts Humanities, Research Council. Sorry, it was just the acronyms. I'm trying to remember the acronyms. And to this primary school in Cardiff. And now Cardiff, a very large proportion of its population is from a Somali background, and there have been Somalians from a very long time, from 18th century and so forth. And there were people from who would classify themselves as Persian, and Syrian, and so forth. So the kind of things I talked about, my own experiences in terms of coming from a northeast country, as well as pursuing topics that are sort of relevant. So, you know, the Greek novelists coming from different areas of the Roman Empire, like Syria, like Egypt, and so forth, and the kind of themes that are in there, they found extremely interesting. But what was most interesting was when we were doing Greek and Latin sort of worksheets, and part of that was looking at Arabic and Hindi as well, and the kind of interconnectedness of languages, and they just absolutely loved it. They were just raving about it. And this has been, I've seen this happen in the past through my access work, where you've got very young pupils being absolutely enamored by the connection of languages, but also the kind of representation of different ethnicities within the Greek and Roman world. And so that's what has worked from my kind of access hat, and really encourage people, you know, primary and secondary schools that go into schools, to think about the kind of interconnectedness of cultures, and how powerful that can be, that somebody can recognize themselves in the theme that you're talking about. So, you know, sort of Black Roman soldier, for example, or a Syrian novelist, or a Phoenician writer, and so forth. So it's actually, that's what's going to be engaging, and they're going to recognize, oh, okay, I can see where that's why I would want to become interested in this, because it's talking about my own culture.
Thank you. Now, Sarah, I see you have your hand up, so I'm going to try and unmute you, or ask you to unmute. Oh, there we go.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank the speaker for their wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Very interesting. I just wanted to say I'm not a classicist, but I work. I am a medievalist, and I have interest in classics just because of reception of Greek ideas into the Islamic world in particular, which is what my interest is, the history of science. What I wanted to share with people, and particularly the speaker, was it would be really helpful, I think, to gather sources that people could access for us as teachers, lecturers, to use for students. The reason I say that is because for the past 3-4 years, well, 3 years ago, I reformulated my undergraduate module that I do, a year 3 optional module, that is about contemporary Islam. And what I found is that it took me a really long time to gather sort of primary sources on young Muslims, or Muslims generally, speaking in their own voices about their own experiences. And what I found is that my students have absolutely loved it. It's completely transformed the way they deal with primary sources themselves, which has been heartening because they're really engaged with it, but also it's really improved their summative work. And I've noticed that their marks have increased. But for me, sorry to go along, but I thought this was worth saying. I think for Islamic studies, etc., contemporary Muslims, the sources, although it took me a while, at least the sources are there. Although it took me a while, I was able to put together appropriate sources, because there's a lot of bumf out there that you don't want them to see. I think that with classics, I think it may be a bit of a challenge to put a similar sort of resource together, but I think it may be worth doing to make it available generally for others. And I'll stop there.
No, that is absolutely right, and I often wonder of how we can make our sources readily available, and the kind of interpretation about those sources. So thinking about a lot of the scholars who've now doing stuff on podcasting and YouTubing, and that kind of how do students get their information, and try to diversify how we teach, not just in the kind of traditional sense, but to use different formats and different mediums. But yes, I think it's really powerful when you show them something that is coming from perhaps a non-white background, and they become, sort of, wow, this is such a powerful voice, and then it makes them interested in that subject.
Yeah, sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, you get a lot of the voices, of course, are from white people who happen to be Muslim. So I don't think these kind of binaries perhaps are not helpful sometimes. And actually this leads me, I'm sorry, I don't want to overtake this conversation, but I think that this brings us directly to the Egyptian experience, where for me, it came as no surprise at all, the reaction of the formal or the state reaction of the Egyptian government, or generally of elite Egyptians, and I think that a direct binary between white and black in that Eurocentric it may serve a helpful purpose at a starting level, but actually it tends to obscure a lot of marginalization that exist within non-white communities, for example. So even, for example, if you look at Sudan, for example, who on the face of it, most people in the Sudan would be considered black, quote unquote, but yet there's a lot of intra-ethnic differences there, which are account for a lot of problems there. For example, as far as I know, you know, there's no marriage across ethnic lines, although to outsiders they may appear, you know, all ethnicity may appear black to us.
No, you're absolutely right. And, you know, I come from a heritage where, you know, in Ethiopia we have over 70 different ethnic groups and languages, and in Eritrea is very similar. And it just seems, you know, sort of we can't homogenize a country.
I think that was just okay. I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I'm dominating this. So thank you very much.
That's okay.
Thanks, sir. Guy, would you like to ask your question, and then we might wrap up?
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. That was fabulous. Really fascinating. Hopefully you can hear me. Just the mention of Martin Bernal, I thought was really interesting, and the discussion about that you had about him, and it just rang a lot of bells with me, with my general feeling that there's an enormous challenge here to decolonize the curriculum, to get classics to think about itself and about its 19th and 20th century roots, the way that it's permeated by scientific ideas of scientific racism, and also by the really pervasive influence of nationalism on classics at formative times when the discipline was coming together. And I think, I mean, in some ways that's kind of visible in these responses about Cleopatra and these other controversies. A lot of them are quite tightly bound up with ideas of nationalism, I think, as well. It was a fascinating talk, and it's really helpful for us actually to think about these things in the context of a new core module that we're running for second years, which is called Past and Present, where we're trying to introduce some of these themes. And I think that's been really helpful and really clarified a lot of things.
One of the things I wanted to also think of, sorry, I don't know if you can see that, but can you see that?
Yep.
Joe's book. So Joe is a colleague from Oxford, In Search of the Phoenicians, and in terms of, because you talked about nationalism and the kind of how do people construct their identity, their national identity, and I thought about it in respect to the film Black Panther, but also in a kind of African-American responses to certain things, where you've got this need for an identity, that you look towards the ancient past and construct it to your own kind of identity, even though it might be a bit more complicated than that. So, for example, the Phoenicians are such an integral part to Lebanese identity, if you see my meaning. Now, there may not be this kind of straight lineage between the Phoenicians. Well, Joe argues there wasn't this, ethnic group as the Phoenicians, but the pushback that she had was from modern Lebanese people who talked about the erasure, that she is putting, across by saying the Phoenicians didn't actually exist as an ethnic group. Now, I'm really intrigued by how people construct their national identity. And it's the same with modern Ethiopians, of how they go back to Solomon and Sheba and ancient Ethiopia, which was Nubia. Meroe is Nubia. I mean, there is obviously ancient Aksum, which was part of Ethiopian Eritrea, but it's that kind of, it's a different side to that coin, isn't it? Where we're looking at how people who have been marginalized construct their identity. And it was the same thing I thought about when I watched Black Panther. I thought, wow, there's this really interesting film, amazing, it did so well, for a Black-led film, but then it kind of homogenized Africa, and it's like, where's the representation of the different African nations? We are seeing it just through the prism of African Americans' experiences of the slave trade, and so there's a representation of West African nations there, but then where are the other nations, So that's intrigues me.
Thanks. Yeah, yeah, the whole debate about the Phoenicians and to what extent we should see them as a people marginalized by anti-Semitism in the 19th century, you know, the Bernal thesis and Corley Quinn's response to that, and now Lopez Ruiz coming back to her, I think is a really fascinating question as well. Thanks.
Sorry, I lost my unmute button for a moment. We might have to call it an end there, but thank you so much for speaking to us, May. Another round of applause, I suppose. Thank you everyone for joining, and I suppose we can draw the session to a close. I shall stop the recording.
Thank you.